Hi everyone, I'm Baihan Lin from Columbia University. Today, I'm going to share with you my work, Geometric and Topological Inference for Deep Representations of Complex Networks. In real life, complex networks are everywhere. You could have a citation networks where each node is a literature or a research domain, or you could have a neural net, which is quite popular these days. You could also have a gene regulatory networks where each node is a gene and their connection would become the regulation process itself. Or you could have a brain connectivity network. Consider 5 nodes in a network. And usually how we characterize the entire graph would be some sort of summary statistics. You could consider this as a binary graph, and as a result, the distance between two nodes might be degrees of jumps in the shortest path from one vertex to another vertex. Or you could consider the full geometric information, where the distance between two nodes are actually the Euclidean distance or other type of distance measure. So the problem that we're interested in is a network inference problem, basically comparing two complex networks. But in this case, each nodes are corresponding. So basically, we have same number of nodes, and those nodes have the same semantic meaning. And usually when we do that, we usually quantitatively compute their summary statistics and then compare those summary statistics as a result of the network inference. So the focus of my work is to develop novel geometric and topological inference methods to better represent the networks when we are trying to comparing. There can be many applications. You could compare two social networks of different users or their functional brain connectivity problem. Or you could even compare gene regulatory networks in different states. But in our domain of interest, currently we're looking at the cognitive and systems neuroscience problem, where the fundamental challenge is to qualitatively relate the brain activity measurement, the behavior measurements, and computational modeling process. In other words, we're interested in how is cognition implemented in the brain. Because afterward, what we're interested in is not just the anatomical structure of the brain, but the functional association of different brain regions when performing a complex task. In this case, shown here is a visual perception task. So how do we do it? To study the cognition in the implementation level, we must first build computational models that can perform cognitive tasks. And those computational models are usually mechanistic or generative, such that we can feed them a large pool of input, maybe like visual stimuli as images or other type of behavior conditions, and then they can output certain things. Maybe they're trained by certain tasks, so they can output that. And shown here you have like different behavior conditions. In here we have 5 different images. But when we are feeding them into the biological brain and artificial neural nets, say, it's pretty hard to compare them properly because, as we know, different brain regions of the brain or different layers of the neural net, despite understanding these days, many of them are still considered a mystery or a black box. So we have to have some approximation of them, which in our case is the measurement of the brain activity or the activations of certain layers of the neural net. Since those computational models usually have some mechanistic property that we can use as our hypothesized space, like we can have a neural net which has a recurrent component versus non-recurrent, or a convolutional component versus non-convolutional, and we also have different brain regions. So when we compare their activity profiles, we can potentially test such models with those brain and behavioral experiments. However, there are many challenges. Like in this cases, the visual stimuli or other type of conditions can be highly unstructured or very complex. It has a lot of semantic information which is not numerical or easily quantifiable. And our computational models, they can have their own nonlinear functional association. And more importantly, when we are doing those type of measurements, those measurements can be high dimensional, and those dimensionalities usually are different. Like in the brain, you have different number of neurons in different brain regions, or if you are doing functional imaging in the brain, you have different number of voxels, basically the small cubes, when we are recording from your whole brain. And also, when we are measuring the activations of a neural net layer, the different number of output channels and different number of neurons in that layer can vary significantly. So if we want to compare them properly, there's dimensionality inconsistency. But more importantly, because what we're trying to characterize is intrinsic association structure of the brains, and the computational model is comparing the activity profiles, the right level when we do this comparing. So the overall measure of success number 1 is to enable the comparison of brain activities and computational model with different number of dimensions here. So the solution is to compare their representations. So despite they have different dimensionality, we see that each row is a pattern corresponding to certain visual input. And we can intuitively compute the dissimilarity or the similarity of 2 different type of activity patterns corresponding to 2 different visual input. And gradually, we can fill in an entire distance matrix, which we call representational dissimilarity matrix, or RDM. So this RDM characterizes the representational space of our visual stimuli. If we take a step back, what we are actually trying to characterize is the intrinsic associated structure of those visual stimuli. So if we consider our brain or computational models from a statistical point of view, they would be some sort of data generating mechanisms, where in certain brain region or computational modules, where we consider as some sort of embedding space, where those semantic concepts of those input are represented in certain type of network. And that is what we are actually trying to compare. However, we cannot directly compare them, so that's why we have a noisy measurement of that embedding space, which is characterized by our activity profiles. And then from that measurement, we would compute some sort of summary statistics, hoping that actually well characterizes the embedding space in the first place. So the problem that we have here, similar to what we have earlier, would be what would be the best geometric and topological inference that we should use to translate from the complex network in the representational space to their summary statistics, such that we can compare them effectively. The overall measure of success number 2 would be to find better summary statistics that can help us compare different computational models with the brain activity. So here is our method state. We basically want to explore different type of summary statistical description of this representation by emphasizing both the geometry and the topology. In this case, basically an intermediate step between the full matrix information towards the representation of a graph. More specifically, we are also interested in like dynamics and information of biological artificial deep neural networks. In the following section, we will see that through this series of techniques, we accomplish both overall measure of success. Here is the method over. So this is a work series where it contains different components of topology, geometry, dynamics, and information. So for this talk, we will only focusing on the representational geometry and topology part, specifically on the independence testing and comparing brain computational models. So first, here is a motivating example. Shown here are the manifold of a hypothetical neural activity corresponding to a series of behavioral conditions. Here, the behavioral conditions are marked by numbers so that we know they are one-to-one corresponding. So they could be different images, but more intuitively, since we are seeing them as organized by a trajectory, they could as well be, say, the manifold of the monkey performing a motor task, where maybe that's the task when you have different frequency or different orientation, then the geometry actually distorted certain bit, so that gave us this manifold. And we quickly notice that the first and third one are geometrically very, very similar. By geometric, we mean having the full information because they are in similar shape. They are both like a flat 8. While the second and the fourth plot, they are also very similar because they're kind of like they are twisted 8, shape of 8. But if you take a greater look in more details, you will notice that actually the third and fourth one are actually not 8. They're actually a ring because the crossing intersection there, they didn't actually cross. So from another point of view, it's actually disconnected. As a result, we can consider them to be topologically similar by organized grouping number 1 and number 2 together and number 3 and number 4 because the first two have 2 loops and third and fourth has only 1 loop. So we want to point out that our definition of geometry and topology is not technically the mathematical term, but only to indicate geometry by having full matrix information and topology by only having the graphical structure, like whether or not they are connected in a graph. Or in other words, the geometry in this case, we consider them to be some sort of distance matrix where it's fully connected, so all the information are being captured. And the so-called topology, on the other hand, here, we're actually showing a network where, say, A and B, because they are so close together, they collapse into one node. And we can represent it as adjacency matrix, where it maybe can be binary, where it indicate whether 2 points are connected or not. So we quickly notice that from a data analytical point of view, when we measure those data points, they are usually quite noisy. If they are considered an isotropic Gaussian noise, the distance that is very big doesn't carry much information for the mutual information itself. While we do not know the actual sizes of the noise, so the distance that are very small could also imply these points are in the neighborhood and can be considered as the same point. While the intermediate distance, they would be carrying the most dependency-related information. So as a result, if we consider the full matrix information, the distance matrix, perhaps a better feature would be the following, where the small distance is collapsed to be 0 and big distance is pushed to infinity, and we call such a transformation to be Geo-Topological transformation because it's an intermediate feature between the full matrix information and binary graph. So we can formulate the Geo-Topological transformation in many ways. Shown here is just an example where we use a linear piecewise function to do such thing, where every distance smaller than lower bound L would be pushed to 0, every distance bigger than upper bound U will be pushed to the maximum. And the optimal upper bound and lower bound can be informed by the data granularity itself. More generically, the transformation function can also be approximated by any monotonic function, say a monotonic neural network. So by varying our lower bound L and upper bound U in this linear piecewise function formulation, we quickly notice that now we have a family of this type of transformations shown here. And we can even potentially have some sort of interpretations where the closer towards, in this threshold space, the closer towards the left top corner would be more geometrically sensitive, and the closer towards the identity line would imply that they are more topologically sensitive. And if you go to more to the bottom left corner, it becomes more emphasizing the local distances, while if you go to the upper right corner, it will be more emphasizing the global structure, global distance of the in your distance distribution. So we can also characterize a similarity with this type of GT transform, because to compare representation, usually we go from the summary statistics we usually have, which is the representational dissimilarity matrix or RDMs, and we compute some sort of correlations or association measure between them. So the closer it is, it will mean that those correlation measures are higher. But we also has just shown that those distance matrix or RDMs can be GT transformed, and we could also potentially choose the best performing representational Geo-Topological matrix, basically the GT transformed RDMs, with different type of objectives like stimuli discriminability or region identifiability, or how separable different models are, or even then statistical dependency. So those are options. We can then define on those measures. If we double center in the RDMs, the cosine distance is actually equivalent to the distance correlate. So as a result, the GT similarity would be equivalent to the adaptive Geo-Topological independence criteria, which we proposed earlier between the activity profile. We could also have some sort of geodesic similarity. So in graph theory, the geodesic distance between two vertices would be the number of edges in a shortest path. We can formulate them in different ways, maybe like nearest neighbor type, where the nearest neighbor can be defined by K, or more generically some sort of percentile P, or we can even view this not from a vertices point of view, but from a graph point of view, where the p is shortest distance. Like the percentiles, like 5% of the shortest distance is being kept. So how useful are those summary statistics? We first test the geotopological transformation on the problem of the independence test, which is quite important in probability theory. Here's an overview of the existing method. There are different types of univariate methods being proposed, which are quite useful, but also limited in their user scenario. Energy-based model like distance correlation or Brownian correlation, they're also quite useful, and especially for high-dimensional linear case. And kernel-based methods like Herbert-Smith independence criteria, they are usually very good for low-dimensional nonlinear cases. While like point cloud-based methods like isomap or topological data analysis, they are quite useful by extracting topological information, but they can be quite computationally expensive. And there are other approaches being proposed as well. We quickly notice that these statistical measures are usually good for only a subset of the problems in the real world. This is also established as the no free lunch theorem in the statistics field. But in our cases, we want to see that if we can combine the benefit of different type of measure and use adaptive technique to basically have the benefit of all of them. So we want our summary statistics to be robust and consistent, expressive enough for complex patterns, and remove and potentially interpret noise in the data. It should be efficient to compute, and they should be comparable across modality. So the specific measure of success with the one-to-one correspondence would be we want the association measure which has a high statistical power in the following scenario, like wide range of realistic patterns. They should be resilient to different noise level. They should be compatible to multivariate study, and also they should offer interpretable insights and consistent with different sample size. Quantitative measurement is the statistical power, which is defined as the fraction of true dataset yielding a statistical power value greater than 95% of the value yielded by the corresponding null dataset under a false positive rate of 5%. So here we have our independence criteria. The algorithm backbone is distance covariance, so distance correlate, which is specified in this formula. Given, then we can have a GT transformed version of this distance correlate. So basically, whenever we compute the pairwise distances, we can have this GT transform applied on top of them before we compute the distance covariance. And then the adaptive components come as these, where we can, for each pairs of thresholds L and Q, we use the GT transform distance as the base. We compute the local correlation given any distance-based measure. Like in this case, we use distance correlation. Finally, to get our statistic, we simply find the smooth maximum of them. Then we can also have different subroutine, a sampling procedure like some noise normalization or even compute inflation. So basically, we can also have cheaper options to converge in a similar way asymptotically. So we perform our independence test with the permutation. So basically, we compute n time to obtain the distribution of the statistic of the actual dataset and the statistic of a null dataset. And we can estimate their p-value, type 1 and type 2 error. As a result, we can get our statistical power. The intuitive example is shown as here, where we have two patterns shown here. One is linear, one is spiral. We see that distance correlation and AGTIC, the AGTIC identifies the patterns in both cases, while distance correlation only finds the relationship in the linear. This is because if we dive deeper in the second and fourth plot, those are all the distance in the x and distances in the y, which is the two multivariate variables that we are computing their dependency upon. The orange part is the subset of distance, that is the matrix information where the AGTIC, our new measure, is emphasizing upon. Everything above that will be considered to be the same in the maximum level, and everything below that will be considered a zero. So because in the spiral cases, what matters when we are identifying the pattern is we highly skeleton. That's why small distance is the most useful thing that you should emphasize in order to locate this pattern. We evaluate our performance in different noise level, sample size, and different dimensionality, as well as interference between this type of different nonlinear patterns in different dimensions. We find that our method is very robust over different noise levels and different sample size. So shown here are the statistical powers of different type of methods in these 5 major real-world patterns, and we see that our AGTIC is one of the best performing ones in all scenarios. And we can also see their relative statistical powers in border range of patterns, which has different sample sizes and different dimensionality. We could also extend on their dependency interference. So those all indicate that they're performing very well. Those all suggest that they're very robust. And if you look at the threshold searching maps, they can be very informative. So in here, the x and y's are actually the transformations thresholding pair, basically LU pairs of the variable x and variable y, and we can see that the colors are the amplitude of the statistic in those thresholds. We quickly notice that AGTIC maps of different patterns can look quite distinct. And we can also find some interpretable features, like linear or patch-like patterns usually have large distance range, while the skeleton patterns don't. The cyclic patterns, they have grid-like structures in the map. Cyclic patterns, they have grid-like structures in the map. And similar dependency will have similar maps, even if they are analytically distinct. We tried this on the neural data. Shown here is the human connectome project data. You can see that the dependency between different brain regions are highlighted here. I will skip the runtime analysis. Basically, it's very manageable. There are also other formulations we can potentially do in place of the GT transform, like we can set a weight on different distances. So that would be a more generic case. The conclusion would be we propose this type of family of geo-topologically independence criteria. It is adaptive, it is distance-based, and theoretically sound, and empirically robust. So if you look back to the specific measure of success, it checks all the lists. Okay, so let's look at comparing brain computational models. We have shown earlier that the representational spaces of visual stimuli can be characterized by this type of representational dissimilarity matrix, which is basically the pairwise distance instances of those activity problems. And we can also potentially extend the notion to some sort of representational topology. Maybe we are interested in like the number of nodes or lines or one hole, two holes inside the representational space in those manifold basically. So with that concept in mind, usually the pipeline that we do, as introduced earlier, would be the same experimental stimuli will be fed into different models, and we have those representational distance matrix of some sort. Existing method will be using some sort of correlations to measure the distance between those type of RDMs. There are also recent interest in comparing representational similarity in the activity patterns level. And of course, we can also consider the intermediate steps between those two levels where distance correlations is trying to measure in the activity patterns, but actually using the distances in the representational dissimilarity matrix level. Similarly, we can have HGTIC in a similar notion. So there are many problems with the existing method. Like recently, people have shown that neural net are all well predicting the human cortex pretty well. So it's pretty hard to distinguish one mechanistic property of the network versus another. And also those differences of those RDMs can be very subtle and can be also subject to idiosyncrasy between the subjects instead of like the brain region itself or the model properties itself. And usually we would use multidimensional scaling to visualize those representational geometry, but sometimes they can be highly non-informative. So we would want to find the summary statistics that characterize the representational space such that different computational models are distinguishable from one another, different brain regions are distinguishable from one another, idiosyncrasy between the subjects and sessions are abstracted out, and we remove different levels of noises that resides in the collected data and offers intuitive insights in dimension reduction visualizations. Quantitative measurement would be model separability, region identifiability, and qualitatively we would inspect the MDS to understand it better. I want to point out that I'm also a main contributor of this toolbox, Python toolbox, which is upcoming. It's called RSA toolbox. It has different components of the representational similarity. Feel free to check out our GitHub report, and there's a work upcoming. Back to our manifold example earlier, that we can visualize their representational dissimilarity matrix. We quickly notice that in this case, because we're using all the full matrix information, RDMs is definitely very similar for the geometrically similar ones. We can also potentially use our Geo-Topological method, where our GTM corresponding to representational Geo-Topological matrices and our GDM, which corresponds to representational geodesic matrices, are shown here. So we notice that it actually abstracted out many geometric or fully matrix information. And to identify some interpretable feature, we perform multidimensional scaling. Shown in each MDS plot, we have 4 dots. Each dot represents a representational matrix or a representational summary statistics from one of the manifold, where the solid line connects the two geometrically similar ones, and the dashed line connects the two topologically similar ones. We see that the RGTM and RGDM both does a good job by distinguishing both the topological dissimilarity and geometrically similarity, while the RDMs, because it only uses the full matrix information, it fails to distinguish those topological distinction and even mix up the orders. Okay, so those are simulated data. So what about real data? So we have both the brain and computational models viewing these 62 different images belonging to different categories, and this is the result, where we have 24 human subjects viewing those images with 6 brain regions being recorded. And then shown here is a heat map. The heat map, the x-axis and y-axis are those thresholds you can see from 0 to 1, and the colors indicates the leave one out evaluation. In this case, it's the brain region decodability. Basically, how accurate can a linear classifier be distinguishing between different brain regions by using this summary statistic parameterized by this L and U. Highlighted in red blocks is the maximum decodability block, which we'll call it the best spot. We can then dive into the interpretability by looking at this Geo-Topology interpretability map. Different parts are marked in different color. Around the identity line, we have those topological sensitive one because L and U's are the same. So basically, what our function doing is to do a binary thresholding of all the edges. And we also have the yellow block, which are highly sensitive with the geometry. However, it also strip out some information of the full matrix information by getting rid of either the small distance or some of the big distance. And then we have the global extractor and local extractor, basically to emphasize different range of the distance. And we have the gray block, which is the intermediate one. And we can average out the accuracy in different zones. We can see how well they are performing. So we quickly notice that not all zones in this Geo-Topology is necessarily beneficial for the purposes of decoding different brain regions. However, we do notice that there are cases like the geometry sensitive version and the intermediate version where it is actually offering some benefits or advantages over the existing method of RDM, where it considers only the fully matrix information and ignores the topological property. We can also potentially do this the same way with the deep neural network here. Shown here is the all convolutional neural net. We saw 10 different layers. It's also initialized with 10 different random seeds as if they have different subjects. And we pre-trained it on the Cypher 10. We tested it on the same set of the 62 images. And we noticed that in this case, almost all other zones of the geometric information is doing better than the representational dissimilarity matrix in its raw format. And we see that the optimal threshold pairs in this case is different from what we see from the non-neural data. This is a good thing because that suggests that the data noise granularity is different in the neural data versus the neural net data. And let's see how our method improves the interpretability of our visualizations. So shown here are two MDS plots, one using the summary statistics of RDM, one using the summary statistics of the RGTMs. So each dot here is one neural net, one layer, and it is using the RDMs or RGTM when we are computing the pairwise distance and do this type of scaling. And different colors represents different layers. And for each color, we see there are 10 dots. Each dot corresponds to a neural net trained with a certain random Z. So basically it's 10 random Z, so 10 dots. And also there are 10 layers, so there are 10 colors. We quickly notice that in RDM cases, like it's very hard to distinguish among like earlier layers. So you cannot see the patterns whatsoever. While in the RGTM cases, you see these perfect transitions where each layers are well separated and colored as well. We can also potentially vary the noise level during the training. Like in this case, we vary the Bernoulli noise used in the basic dropout, and then we can see that the optimal threshold is definitely differs from different noise levels. So if we look back to our specific measure of success, it checks all the marks. Next, I will go through a few projects which I do not have time to go through in detail. The first one is higher order topological simplicial analysis, where it's a novel topological data analysis specified to propose to deal with high throughput, high dimensional data with many data points, and also it can have interpretable insights on time series and other things. And we can also investigate the dynamic representational geometry by basically separating neural data or model components if you are using a recurrent neural net, and you can see how different time steps change over time. And we see interesting dynamics that can help us adjudicate between critical process in the cognition in the brain. And we could also potentially use progressive alignment to even augment our approach such that we can compare those different snapshots of representational space where no intertemporal distances are available. So now we can interpret them in many interesting ways. If we consider the neural net as a model selection process, we can potentially estimate the minimum description length of different models in the layer level. So in this project, we characterize the information flow within the network modules in a deep neural net. So we can compute some measure of model complexity of different neural nets, and they can be extended not only to probe the information flow of the neural nets during training, testing, and deployment, but also help us adjudicate among different architectures of the models. And as a plus, it also improves empirical performance of computer vision and reinforcement learning tasks by using it as a normalizing factor. Thank you. For more details, please refer to our work as this archive paper, and feel free to contact me at Baihan Lin at Columbia